I'll just start putting this word out here, permaculture, and telling a little bit of how I came to it. I actually started my journey into this field by studying cultural anthropology at college. I was really interested in, how and why human culture looks the way it does. And something that came out of that degree for me was this understanding of how much the way we get our food has shaped human culture across time. And it was the first time in my life, really, in college that I considered that humans might actually not be on the best trajectory ever. And it felt somehow that the answers to a lot of the problems we were seeing in our culture and in our society were linked to food. And I didn't know exactly what that meant, but I decided to start farming. I started farming when I was 21. I've been doing some version of that ever since. Spent my first 5 or 6 years farming actually focused on kind of what we call organic or regenerative farming. But when I was looking around at this organic vegetable farm I was a part of, what really landed with me again and again is this looks nothing like nature. There's black plastic everywhere. It's flat. I don't see any trees. It wasn't until years later that I actually came across this concept of permaculture, but I think it hit for me on everything I was feeling in my gut that I couldn't yet articulate. And so you will hear so many definitions of permaculture from different people you talk to. But the way that I really like to think about it is how do we actually use ecology, healthy wild ecosystems, as a model for how we grow our food? This doesn't have to relate just to food cultivation. It's really a design art. I am going to lean into food a little bit in this presentation because that's my passion and background. But I just wanted to kind of frame that overarching definition. And in a moment, I'll tell you how I use it today. As we go through this presentation, I'm not going to go through all these principles one by one, but I am going to reference them. Because basically, in permaculture, there's this idea that every decision that we make is grounded in three ethics, which are care for earth, care for people, and fair share. How do we distribute abundance? And then everything else I see as a toolkit for people who forgot how to live in relationship to the land to remember how to do it. And so I just wanted to frame that big concept and won't get into any more definitions today, but this is a high level visual of what permaculture is. I wanted to start with what actually got me into the project that I currently run. When I was growing up, the way that I was taught as a human to relate to ecosystems was mostly as an observer. I went on hikes, I looked at plants. When I was a kid, I mostly couldn't name them and I didn't particularly have an interest to. I thought, oh, this scene is beautiful. I was really taught leave no trace. That is the best thing you can do in an ecosystem. But as I've gotten older and deeper into this work, one of the things that feels like this enormous paradox to me is when we put so much energy into conserving the wild places around which we live so that we can hike and enjoy them and value their truly beautiful inherent ecology and diversity. And at the same time, the food that we're eating is completely obliterating ecologies somewhere else. In our case, many times, this beautiful kind of tall grass, prairie, oak savanna ecosystem that makes up the Midwest. And so, one of these permaculture principles that has always landed with me really well is this obtain a yield. It's this question of it is amazing to conserve wild spaces. It's incredibly important for the health of the planet and to give us somewhere to learn and observe. But in the places that we have already destroyed beyond their ecological kind of, you know what I'm trying to say, the way that they were historically, how do we actually redesign those places to act as their own healthy, functional ecosystems that also feed us? And so that's where a lot of my curiosity comes from in my work. And the simplest way to ask that question for me was, what does it actually take to sustain me? What is the impact that my life is having on the actual world around me, at least in relationship to food? And so in 2020, about 6 years ago now, I started this project called the Niwot Homestead, which I'm still running. It started when I posted on Nextdoor looking for land, and these lovely humans in this picture, Rod and Barb, responded to that ad. I still, 6 years later, have not gotten a good picture of them doing something other than picking gunk out of their dog's eye, but that's the picture I have. But such lovely people who basically opened up their acre-and-a-half property and said, yeah, you're welcome to play here. And it started as this very personal vegetable garden, and I started playing with forest gardening and some other things I'll mention, but it grew organically in ways I never imagined into what it has become today. And so I'll be referencing this project a lot as we go through this presentation. I just wanted to give a little bit of context for what I'm talking about. I stole the before pictures from Zillow because I didn't take any myself. But basically, on this 1.3 acre property, about 1 acre of which we're really cultivating, we've gotten to a point where we can feed a complete diet to, at this moment, 1.8 people, that's grounded in meat and fruit and vegetables and staple crops in this kind of context of a holistic ecosystem. And so just wanted to give some visuals to show that as we go through. To me, the question that really has fascinated me is how do we grow a complete diet? Because if I grow vegetables and eat them, but yet import most of my calories in the form of rice or beans or wheat from another big monoculture destructive farm, to me, that doesn't solve the problem. I want to understand the balance of things that will make it possible to actually stay alive in this bioregion. I am not going to talk about livestock anymore after this because I suspect that most of us are in urban and suburban settings where having a pig is totally out of the question. But I just love pigs so much as an illustration of the way that my thinking has changed as I've gone through this project that really relates to permaculture. And so most people will probably tell you that pigs are among the most destructive of animals. Blanket statements, pigs destroy land. We maybe have heard similar statements of cows are bad, eating meat is bad. These kind of things that label organisms inherently problematic in one way or another. In the beginning, I kind of believed that, but we got pigs for a couple of different reasons. And we since have come to rely on them completely in our systems. And I'll tell you why, is pigs are the best rototiller you can imagine. Every time we finish growing staple crops like wheat or rye or amaranth or sorghum, we let the pigs and chickens come and the pigs till up the soil for us. They eat weed roots out of the soil. The chickens fertilize. We don't have to till, we don't have to add fertilizer. They're doing that for us. The even better discovery that we eventually had is that pigs and chickens actually live extremely well together. We started out having them in separate systems. And what we discovered is we just couldn't free range our chickens because they were getting eaten by predators immediately. And so for years, we would start with 35 chickens and would end with none for a year and the next year. And finally, I thought, well, what if we actually put them together? Nobody wants to mess with a pig, it turns out. And so when we merged those two systems, we now have zero predation amongst our chickens. But it's even better than that because the chickens also scratch through the pig poop and they eat out fly larvae, and then we don't have flies. Um, we feed our animals 90% food that's diverted from waste streams in the community. It turns out a lot of the foods that pigs don't like peppers, chickens really do. So together they clean it all up. And so I actually have even seen these chickens standing next to the pigs individually picking ticks or mites off of them. And so the reason that I bring up this story first is really to just bring up this idea that when we actually understand it's not about whether organisms are good or bad, it's how they relate to other organisms in a system that defines whether they have a positive or negative effect on the land. And this idea that instead of segregating our systems and having our plants over here and our animals over here, when we merge them, we actually end up doing a lot less work and kind of copying the ecology in a way that really supports overall ecosystem health. And so that's it for animals. No more pigs will be in plants the rest of the time, but it was an important learning for me about the value of putting systems together. I want for a moment to just go through something that has felt like the most important framework for understanding how to use ecology to design. And so might feel like a tangent for a moment, but let me just run through this really quickly. Probably will remind you of your high school ecology lessons you didn't pay too much attention to, but most natural ecosystems have some kind of disturbance. It could be flood, it could be fire, it could be something actually a whole lot less dramatic, like a tree falling over or a pig running through a forest and digging it up. After disturbance, there's a particular type of plant that usually comes back first. These plants we like to call weeds. Um, but I put on this slide pictures of a couple of different collections of plants we call weeds. All of the ones on the left are non-native species that have arrived here. Things like mullein, things like knapweed. On the right are things we also call weeds, lamb's quarter, wild amaranth, maybe sunflower, that are considered native here. And so just to make this point that in all ecosystems, there are plants that, as Wendell Berry, the farmer author, says, serve as nature's band-aid. When Earth is disturbed, they get to that site really quickly and they anchor it and they hold it and they shade it and they start building the conditions for the next generation of plants to emerge. And in this bioregion, this is where we often end on the plains, but perennial grassland or prairie tends to emerge as the next generation of plants. If there's still more water, shrubs start to appear. If there's even more water, trees start to appear, these kind of early pioneer species of trees like aspen or a lot of the softwoods. And if you live in a different climate and place other than Colorado, you might eventually get to these old hardwood kind of oak. Oak is an example of a species you would find in this type of old hardwood forest. And so what we're basically looking at in that progression is succession ecology, ecological succession. This is a simplified schematic of how in nature we tend to move from disturbance all the way up to hardwood forest. A few things will stop that progression in its tracks. One of those things is lack of water. In a little bit, we're going to actually get more into the water management side of things to understand how that might apply to us. But there is no circumstance in a natural ecosystem that I've ever been made aware of, I should qualify, that you stop at annual weeds. In almost every case, you move to either grassland or shrubland or forest. And the thing about all of these stages is these are the phases of ecology where we can actually start building soil, rebuilding the damaged soil that got disturbed in the first place. We start ending up with habitat. We start ending up with more diverse, complex relationships between organisms. We start sequestering carbon. My curiosity for you and Ben, maybe can we stick this in the chat for a moment? We'll give you just a couple seconds to answer here, is where does most of our food today sit in this progression of plants?
Should be good to go. I updated the chat settings.
Brilliant. Thank you. I'm seeing annual, weeds, shrubs maybe. Weeds, perennial. You all are great. Mostly our food crops today are the descendants of weeds. About 90%, in fact, of the food that humans depend on to survive today is a weed. Ben, is my slideshow showing? Sorry, I can't see it on my side.
Yes, you're all good. We're still on the succession ecology slide.
Okay, brilliant. Just wanted to double check. And so there is a reason why a lot of our food system looks this way. In fact, it's a really easy way to get a lot of calories fast, to manage simplistic systems, to use mechanized cultivation. But everything from wheat to rice to potatoes to vegetables, all of these things that we really depend on fit in this annual weeds category. The problem with that is in order to recreate the conditions they actually like and want, we have to keep redisturbing and redisturbing and redisturbing. And we never get to a point where our systems can actually build their own fertility again. That's, to me, the crux of the issue with our food system actually is that we have to till and we have to bring in outside resource to keep these systems going. Another question that I sometimes pose to people is where in this progression is best? Where are we trying to get? What is the healthiest ecology? And the answer to that is a little bit of a diverse answer because in most cases it's a mosaic. It's when this process keeps restarting and getting set back and restarting and getting set back. So at any one time, the landscape has pockets that are in all sorts of these phases. And if you've hiked in the mountains, you've probably seen places where there's meadow and aspen and lodgepole pine and all of these different communities coexisting together. Beautiful example of diversity. There usually is about 10% of a landscape in this phase. However, today, 90% of our crop systems are in this phase. And so, one of the questions that permaculture really invites us to ask is how do we actually design food systems that copy a grassland, a shrubland, a forest that use that ecology to actively build fertility and sequester carbon and produce food in a way that we don't have to manage nearly as much? Um, and so, just to give an example of how this whole structure is really useful and kind of in patterning, really quick intro to how we actually see soils getting built. This is a pit I found in Boulder County that I thought was just such a beautiful example of soil horizons. I took a photograph of it, but basically, what you can see here is that soil is two things. One part is the ground up rock that often exists lower in the area and doesn't necessarily have any living material in it. It's just ground up rock. It's the mineral. It still affects the soil, but it's not alive. On the soil surface, you have a whole collection of organic matter, whether that's leaves or scat or living plant roots that are decomposing at the top. Then there's a whole collection of organisms that take all that broken down material and they start eating it. And they eat it and eat it and eat it. First, the bacteria get there. Then many creatures eat the bacteria. There's a whole, yeah, the whole soil food web's immensely complicated. But the point of it is every time one organism eats another one, they poop. And in that poop is the nutrients our plants need to grow. And at the very last point of that process, you end up with a piece of organic material that has been eaten as much as it can be eaten. It no longer has nutritional value, but it's sturdy and stable, and that is sequestered carbon. That's something we often call humus. Um, and so when we get into these higher phases of succession, that's what's happening. We're sequestering carbon and building this dark, rich top layer where all of the mineral is getting mixed with the organic matter on top to form what we call soil. When we are actually going about planting a garden, designing a landscape, where on succession we fall with our landscape actually is a huge determinant of how we should prepare our soil. We could get into this for an hour, but I wanted to give a light introduction to it because to me, this is kind of the frame of thinking that says, deciding to grow a garden, you're actually deciding which phase of succession do I want to use, and then what collection of plants and soil prep do they want? And so on this side of annual weeds, when we have highly disturbed soil, it tends to be incredibly bacterial. Disturbance kills all soil organisms to some extent, but bacteria is the fastest to rebound. So you'll see a huge amount of bacteria. You'll often see soils that are exposed. They're hot. They're open to the elements. That is exactly what annual weeds like. That's what they are adapted to grow in. As you go along, that soil begins to change, and something really important happens around here, which is that wood enters the picture. And it turns out that wood is incredibly difficult to digest. And one organism is very good at digesting it, and that is fungi. And so you have some fungi down here, but the further you get into the old hardwood forest, the more fungal your soil becomes. When your soil is incredibly fungal, these annual weeds no longer like it. I'll tell you a story about this because when I was farming in Massachusetts, very first farm I was at, my farm manager was just starting to learn about this idea of no-till and getting quite excited about it. And so I was there 3 years, and in the first year I was there, we stopped tilling the beds in the greenhouse, and instead we started mulching them with woody materials. We kept growing our vegetables in there. By the third year I was there, the annual brassicas, the cabbage family plants that are so far on this end of the spectrum, actually stopped growing. They stopped doing well at all in those beds. However, baby trees started growing out of our beds. And I told my farm manager the greenhouse was just trying to turn into a forest, but he wasn't going to have it. So we ended up starting to till again because those plants actually needed that disturbance. On the flip side of that, when we're trying to discourage weeds from growing on our sites, plants we call weeds anyway, when we develop this rich fungal stable soil, it just happens. And I've watched that with my own eyes on our site. And I think one of the reasons that we often don't see that happen is the plants that we're trying to grow are weeds themselves. And so we have to keep ourselves over here to grow them. Things like vegetables, a lot of annual ornamentals, but we can actually use the soil to encourage the type of plant that we're trying to grow. Just to give an example of that in practice, a couple of ways I love disturbing soil that are a little bit less destructive than a full-blown rototiller, but still provide enough disturbance to actually get our crops to grow. One, of course, is a pig. I did say I wouldn't mention them. That might have been a lie. They're a big part of our system, so I might sneak them in here and there. But also a broad fork, amazing tool that actually opens the soil at a deep level without flipping it completely. Um, Something else to think about is that a lot of these annual crops actually really don't want woody mulch. And so we grow our own wheat and rye, and we use that straw as mulch in the vegetable garden and places where we're trying to grow annuals. And before you think that's a ludicrous idea for your backyard, we actually grow a fairly small 2 plots of wheat and rye. I'm trying to remember this. I think it's about 20 by 30 feet each. And from both of those, we get 60 loaves of bread a year and enough mulch for our vegetable garden. So just thinking of the kind of closed loops we can build that way and get a yield out of them. I'll show you a picture of the mature forest garden at our homestead in a little bit. You saw one a few slides back, but when we originally set out to prepare that, it was just this big grassy lawn under some fruit trees. Um, we put a bunch of horse manure, we layered cardboard on top of it, and we put wood chips on top of that, extremely dense. We've done an addition of wood chips a couple of times, but this strategy of building soil didn't disturb the soil at all. We got to digest all those grass roots right in place, basically building a compost pile on the entire area that we're on. But the advantage of doing this in place and not hauling the compost in is that all the earthworms actually tunnel up to get all those goodies and they aerate your soil. And all that fungal material begins to break down and create the fungal conditions that a forest garden really wants. And so you can kind of see this is the back end of that a couple years later after we had sheet mulched the entire thing. But choosing your mulch materials to meet your phase of succession immediately begins to encourage the plants that you want and help them thrive without a whole lot of intervention. I'm going to go through these phases of succession briefly to discuss how we might use them. I'm not going to spend too much time in the beginning because it's less relevant to us, but I will just go briefly through it. And so this word weeds has a really negative connotation for both of us, but I want to again in the chat just for a moment pose the question, ecologically, what are weeds really good at? What is the niche that they fill for us in a useful way as a plant? And let's just take a couple seconds to answer that here. Whoops, that's not what I meant to do. Sorry, I can't get back to the chat without minimizing that.
Okay. Chat settings are good. Sorry for the delay there.
So I'm seeing a lot around ground cover and covering the soil. I'm seeing the word quickly come up a lot, and I think that that is one of the gifts of annual plants is they grow quickly. That is their strategy, is get there, grow like crazy, and then set seed like crazy. Let's see if anything else is coming up here. Weeds bring nutrients up to the top level of the soil. Love that. We'll talk about that a little more. They shade the soil. They bring carbon down. They keep microbes alive. Amazing. We are a crowd that clearly is in great appreciation of weeds, which I love. Let me get back to my slideshow here really quick. Um, so I think what you all said resonates deeply that really the ecological function of weeds is they are competitors. If you look at the seed dispersal mechanism in pretty much every weed, it's one of two things. It's either wind dispersed like a dandelion, or it's a sticky, gnarly thing that's going to catch the clothing of any person or the fur of any animal and move to a new spot. They are good at getting themselves around because they depend on that intermittent disturbance to keep going. So they set seed really well. They get their seed around. They grow incredibly fast. It turns out that these species are some of the most nutritious plants that we can eat. Not surprising, since that's what we've ended up eating, because their roots are so good at, as you say, stabilizing the soil and getting deep and bringing all that nutrient up in their leaf litter. What's really cool to me to think about is when you have a whole field of the tastiest, most nutritious plants you can imagine, guess who comes to eat them? All sorts of birds and animals who are bringing seed from other ecosystems and leaving it behind. Seed from shrubs, seed from grasses, seed from fruits. To bring that as well as their own manure, they're actually then able to push succession to the later phases. So the weeds are almost attracting all of those animals in to eat them down and poop and set the stage for the next generation of plants to emerge. I put a pig here again. Sorry. They might show up one or two more times, but it turns out that a pig's absolute favorite food is bindweed. That has also been true of my goats. That has also been true of the cattle I've raised. I eventually thought that it must be true for humans too, because they tell us so much and I tasted it and it's really not delicious. But you think of those roots reaching 20 feet down into the ground and bringing up all the nutrient that they get. That's exactly the function that they're fulfilling to help us get succession further along. We'll talk about that a little more in a moment. Grasslands and prairies are the dominant ecosystem that probably was where most people currently live today. I think just for the sake of time and relevance, I won't get into prairie ecology too deeply, but just on a very high level, these ecosystems are so entirely codependent with grazing animals that it is almost impossible to replicate that ecology without them. And so I absolutely have made like pocket prairie meadows. And when I ran my landscaping business, I was really into doing that. But I eventually realized like I'm not really copying prairie ecology because it's at a scale that I just can't really replicate in the context that I'm working in. And so, from a ranching and farm management perspective, there's a lot to say there. But I think for most of us who live in urban places, here's our greatest opportunity. When we actually looked at that ecological succession schematic, we said that the limiting factor in progressing from one phase of succession to the next is often water. In our prairie grassland areas, we tend to get 16, maybe 20 inches of water a year. It's not enough or consistent enough to actually allow most of that area to become forested. There was not a single tree away from a river in this kind of flat plains area pre-Western settlement. And so we have grassland. However, when you look at this overhead aerial imagery of a neighborhood in Boulder, I would estimate that probably over 50% of the total land area is actually a roof or a road or sidewalk or driveway. If you could catch all of the water that fell on those surfaces and push it into the land that is still there, you could effectively double your annual rainfall so long as you can hold it in the soil and push it up to 32 to 40 inches a year, easily enough to sustain trees and shrubs without supplemental irrigation. Instead, what do we usually do? We let all that water run off our hardscapes into the drain, and then we pay money to irrigate our landscapes. And so I think last year for Resource Central, I gave a much more in-depth discussion of how to actually design these kind of water catchments. I'm not going to have time to go into deep detail on that today. But the idea here is basically, as one of my colleagues likes to say, how do we turn runoff into run on? How do we push water into our landscape? And when we get these big rain events, store it in ground and use our soil as such a sponge that we hold on to it. And when these systems are well designed, I've actually seen soils that a month after a big rain are still wet. A couple light strategies just to talk about how to do this. This was one of my friend's houses that I did a little design for. I usually don't love using rock because it doesn't hold water as much, but that's what she wanted. But there is a downspout here. This catchment is at a 2% off contour grade so that it pulls the water along it, but allows it to infiltrate the whole way. This exact size is the amount that that comes off of that roof in a 1 inch rainstorm, which is typically our largest rainstorm. And so this is 100% passively irrigated as these plants are established. This was just year one, so it's grown a fair amount since then. Same idea here. We're taking the water from the roof through this dry riverbed at a 2 degree angle to get it, or 2 degrees percent slope to get it to move. And then we're taking it into these level contour swales where the water will pool and soak in. When we do rainwater harvesting, we are basically creating a new riparian area. There are a whole lot of plants we could choose to put in that, but one of my deep philosophies and something permaculture teaches us is how do we actually copy and use the ecology of the areas that we inhabit as a guide for what to plant and how to plant it. And so I absolutely love walking the riparian areas near my house to serve as my guide for what should I plant. How do we design forests, riparian forests that actually follow the ecological principles of our cottonwood savanna. I like to call it a savanna because that is the intersection of trees and grassland. And most often our riparian areas are not large enough to be a true forest. So that's why I'm using that word savanna. And so the first thing we can do is we can say what's growing there. And we can look at this lovely collection of plants that I see growing all over our savannas, and we can say, oh, I see these down by my creek. I'm going to use that plant, or maybe a relative of that plant in design. And in fact, many of these plants, even exactly as they are really useful edibles. But what feels even more important to recognize about this is often when we talk about a native plant, we just see an organism. I could, for example, decide, I'm trying to think of a good mountain example here, that I'm going to plant quaking aspen in my backyard because it's a native. And I could do that, but in fact, sits in a totally different microclimate and even climate zone than my backyard, even though it's technically a native plant. And all of the ecological benefits that that plant has often exist in that spot. And so when I'm looking at trying to use native plants as a model, I'm actually looking at communities of native plants. How do those plants work together? What insect associates do they have? What habitat do those insects need? How can we design all of that into a cohesive system that we're copying rather than just pulling individual species out of it? A concept in permaculture for this idea is a guild. Some of you may have heard this term. It's basically a collection of organisms that works together instead of competing with each other to create their own kind of mini ecology. And it's worth saying that when I grew up, basically I was taught plants compete. And I think in our culture, we tend to have this very strong narrative of competition. And in actual fact, when I was vegetable gardening as a child, that was 100% true. The weeds were competing with my tomatoes. The weeds were competing with my lettuce, but the reason they were competing is because they were actually plants in exactly the same niche as my lettuce and tomatoes. The whole art of design and design in a kind of polyculture guild way is how do we actually pick plants that exist in different niches so they are not competing with each other, but rather supporting each other. And I'll speak to what that looks like in a moment here. I'll also show a guild that is modeled off of a cottonwood savanna. But just to give an example with this picture, this is the forest garden at the Niwot Homestead. I think I showed you the picture of this being sheet mulched earlier. This is horseradish. This is a cherry tree that we planted. These are Egyptian walking onions, a lovely type of perennial onion. We let some of our wild naturalized dock grow in here as well. This is a Siberian pea shrub who's a nitrogen fixer. I believe there is a gooseberry creeping in just here. And so you can see there's this whole collection of different plants that at this point just do their thing. We don't really manage them other than to harvest them because we figured out the right kind of juicy combination of plants to fill these roles. And so when we're looking at how to do this kind of design, one strategy we can have is what plants are growing together in the wild. And so when I walk the areas around my place in Niwot, all of these plants on the left are plants that I often see. You'll notice that I do have some truly native plants in here, and I also have plants like poison hemlock, which are not considered native, but nevertheless, they're growing there and they're filling a niche. And so I'm looking at that and I'm saying, why is that plant there? What is it doing? Who is it growing next to? Why is that happening? Because there's so many associations between those plants that we may never even yet understand. But a very common thing that I see is that we have Rosaceae or rose family trees, which, by the way, is most fruit: apple, pear, cherry, plum. I might not want chokecherry in my forest garden, but I might take a cherry tree, who is a very close relative and fills a similar niche. Likewise, I could actually take our native golden currant, which is pretty tasty in my opinion, or I could choose their relative as a cultivated currant. Maximilian sunflowers are they're a very, very close cousin to sunchokes. Poison hemlock and fennel are actually in the same niche because they're in the same plant family. They have the same flower shape, they have the same ecological role. We'll talk about that in a sec. Wild licorice is a lovely nitrogen fixer. I might use that. I might pick clover. But the idea here is I don't even need to know what's going on between all of these plants to understand that if I copy their patterning, I'll end up with some beneficial things going on my end. Not very scientific, but it's really using observation of wild ecologies as a model. Um, but when we actually are in a more strategic or maybe just trying to understand what's actually going on way, going about designing polycultures, one of the first things to think about is root system type. I'm sure some of you have heard the example of the three sisters, and I sometimes like to give this just because it's a familiar one, but many indigenous peoples cultivated these plants, the three sisters, together. The reason that's often cited that that was done is that corn acts as a living stake for the beans that wind up the corn. Um, the squash acts as a kind of ground cover and weed suppressant and shades and cools the whole area. And then the beans fix nitrogen for the corn. Amazing. But one thing I was never really taught is what's actually going on under the soil, right? Because we have corn with this relatively deep kind of lateral root system. The squash is shallow and spreading, and then the beans are fibrous in the middle. Those roots are actually at different places in the soil. They're not competing. They're taking up nutrients from different spots, and they're also supporting microorganisms for a much larger area. And so when you put plants together, if you take a big old tap-rooted plant like this daikon radish here, and you stick it next to mint with its rhizomes, those two plants are not competing with each other underground. They're filling different niches and they're actually supporting the soil ecology and one another even better. Um, Other roots have a bulbous form or a tuber. This is actually my favorite weird plant. It's called skirret. If you ever get a chance to eat it, try it. It's like a vastly better version of a perennial carrot. Um, but just to show that there are so many different forms roots can take under the soil, and when we put them together, we end up with non-competition. And again, just to say, much like any other carrot family plant, poison hemlock has a taproot, wild licorice has rhizomes, Maximilian sunflower has tubers. I didn't have to know that to copy this guild, but that is part of what is going on here. Likewise, it's really helpful to pick plants that bloom across a long spread of the season. Some of the earliest blooming plants are those rose family kind of fruit trees. I think they look quite similar. This might have been our apricot. But either way, wild plums, apples, they all look quite similar. And have typically an early spring bloom time. Mints show up in the midsummer. This is an elderberry who's also kind of a late spring, early summer bloomer, sometimes into midsummer. Echinacea is late. Many of the sunflower families are late. And so having that full spread is essential because there are many pollinators who only wake up for 2 or 3 weeks at a time. And if you don't have what they are going to be looking for, they're not going to stick around and they're not going to stay there. It's also beautiful, a side effect, to have things blooming throughout the season. You've heard me already reference plant families a few times, and I personally find plant families the easiest way to work with polyculture because so many of the characteristics we just looked at, from bloom time to root system structure to seed dispersal, all of those things often track by plant family. There is always an exception. Everybody has a crazy uncle somewhere in the family, and the plant families are no different. Some of them really defy the rules, but generally they have a lot of commonalities. And so, just to cite a few of the ones that I see showing up again and again, these are families I also would call generalists. It's a lot easier to garden with generalist families who are adaptable to a wide range of conditions than it is to garden with extreme specialists who might need this specific insect and soil condition and plant in order to thrive. That would be amazing, and I hope to get there in my forest garden. But at the moment, I'm copying the families I see showing up all over the place in natural ecosystems. And the first one you see over here on the left are the asters. They tend to be more on that side of colonizer species or weed for sure. They often have a kind of tufty dandelion-like seed head. This family are the brassicas, who there is almost not a single perennial brassica out there, this cabbage family. This happens to be sea kale, who is a perennial. Horseradish is a perennial, but the vast majority of vegetables that we eat actually sit in this family. Cabbage, turnips, arugula, rutabagas, broccoli, cauliflower. It's no wonder in a way that we have such pest pressure because it turns out that a lot of insects also prefer to eat within certain plant families. So when you put an explosion of brassicas in your property, you are inviting a whole lot of brassica eating pests to come. And if you break up that buffet with other different types of species, that will help a lot, or plant families, excuse me. The mints tend to be summer blooming, excellent flowers for generalist pollinators. They often have a rhizome root structure, or at least they spread quite a lot through seed, but rhizome is a very common pathway. Our onion family almost always has bulbs. They're a really good deterrent for creatures. Well, I say that. Generally, most creatures don't like super aromatic plants. Rabbits, deer, etc. Although if they are hungry, I have definitely had them plow down some onion crops before. This is that Rosaceae family that most of our fruit sits in. Here are the mallows. And again, my point here, we don't have to get into the granularity of every plant family, but characteristics track by family. And often when you find an assortment of families that always do really well together, that's an incredibly helpful design tool. I can safely say that if I put a mint family plant, a carrot family plant, an onion family plant, an aster, and a mallow together, I'm going to have a diverse polyculture that does what I need it to do and self-sustains. Um, for the record, these are related to that weedy mallow that we have as well. This is a hollyhock here, but they both have this really mucilaginous quality that is helpful for stomach ailments. They both have tap roots. Um, they have a very similar shape of flower and seed head, so we're just tracking those commonalities by family. This is an example of a complete guild that's assembled with all of these characteristics in mind. Diverse above ground niche, diverse root system, bloom time, family, function. The principle that I think that sits behind this form of design more than anything else is this idea that solutions should be additive. Many of the solutions that I see around me today rest on this idea that, oh, you have a pest. Eliminate the pest and your problem will be solved. I actually don't believe in pests anymore. I think most of the creatures that we call pests are actually beneficial herbivores who have gotten out of balance in some sort of way. But these insects that we call pests are also bird food, and they form a really important ecological function. And so this is one really potent example of that philosophy at work. I'm sure that many of you have eaten suburban apples that have holes in them. It turns out that the creature that eats those holes in is often a codling moth larva. There are wasps that will parasitize those larvae, and those wasps are attracted by plants in the carrot family with these big umbel flowers. So if you plant carrot family plants under your apple trees, your apples won't have holes. I had heard that for years and I didn't totally believe it was true, although it was textbook true for me. But at one point, we have these old apple trees on this homestead property from probably 100 years ago, and the vegetable garden sits near them. And one year, an explosion of wild carrots just took over, mostly from neglect early in the project. So they were full of these umbel flowers and wasps. There was not a hole on those apples. The apples on the other side of the property covered in holes. And so today in our forest garden, we've really prioritized putting as many of these carrot family plants in amongst our trees as possible. And in fact, have noticed a real difference in the quality of the fruit and its intactness. And so just this idea that Bill Mollison, one of the founders of permaculture, said, you don't have a snail problem, you have a duck deficiency. If something is out of balance, bring something into the system to correct it. Don't have the reductive approach of getting rid of something because it actually causes a snowball of negative effect. I'm sure many of you on this call have been to Harlequin's Gardens Nursery, and I worked there briefly for a couple of years, but I remember people would always come into the nursery and ask Michael, the owner, about their aphids and what they should do about them. And he would say nothing, just leave them, which shocked people a little bit, but most of the time, if you left them long enough, their predators showed up to take care of them. And once their predators were there and they had a stable population of aphids to eat, there were still aphids, but never enough to really cause a problem. If you sprayed those aphids and killed them right away, the ladybugs would never have come. There wouldn't have been enough food to sustain them. And so now you're back in that same negative cycle, reductive cycle that we're often trying to avoid. Another example of this principle in our forest garden is when we got there. In fact, I think you might even have been able to see this in a picture way back in the presentation, but there were these couple of old pear trees that were already on the site in that kind of unirrigated lawn. They were covered in fire blight. And for those of you who have dealt with apple trees, fire blight is a really common disease that we suffer from in Colorado. You'll see that the tips of the leaves actually wither black and kind of wither back into the tree. I had been told by arborists that once you have fire blight, you probably will have it for good. You can prune it out to keep it at bay, but you'll never fully get rid of it. So first year I was there with our all the procedures and the sterilized snips, we hacked back what amounted to over a third of these couple of trees to get the fire blight out. We then lasagna mulched that whole forest garden with manure and cardboard and wood chip, planted an understory. The fire blight hasn't even been back slightly since. Haven't seen a trace of it. And to me, that's this really powerful illustration that plants are like people. If they have a healthy immune system, they can fight off illness. If we have a healthy enough soil, those plants will actually be able to fend off their own disease. And so again, we're not trying to get rid of the disease. We're trying to build enough health and resilience in the system that it can fight the disease on its own. Um, Another interesting point just to think about in that vein is as plants get healthier, the sugars in their leaves actually get more complex. And the more complex a sugar gets, the harder it is for certain insects to eat it. And so if you have incredibly complex sugars in your leaves, aphids cannot eat your plant. And so healthy plants actually also deter eating insect pests that way. And this really messes with our psychology because when we go to the store, we often want the plant that looks the most blemish free because instinctually we know that that is the healthiest plant. However, we've disguised that by spraying them like crazy so they no longer have that health and nutrition, but they look like they do. Organic produce that is really healthy shouldn't have a whole lot of holes in it. Whether we get to that ideal or not is another story, but I have watched that at play in my systems is when we get to a level of soil health, our brassicas don't get eaten by insects anymore. They just don't. And so again, just thinking of this concept of additive solutions. Um, I suspect many people would not stick these two words together in the same sentence as glorious bindweed, but I think again, I've actually come to love this plant more than almost any other plant on our property, and I'll tell you why. In the vegetable garden, we pull it out because much like our vegetables, it fills that weed niche, and it's way better at it than our vegetables, and if we didn't pull it out, we wouldn't have any vegetables. I understand why people do that. In the forest garden setting that we have, I have started letting it grow as a free ground cover around all of our perennial plants. Every now and then, when it looks like it's going to actually swallow one, I will pull it back lightly. But what's amazing about this is in all of those mulched areas that we have not yet had perennial plants take hold, I will go out there on a hot summer day and I will stick my hand into that thicket of bindweed and then I'll put it adjacent on the path where there's no bindweed. The temperature difference is about 20 degrees. Inside the bindweed, it's moist and it's cool, and the soil is actually holding its moisture vastly better. The other thing that I notice is that there are native mason, or not mason, excuse me, sweat bees all over those flowers who otherwise wouldn't have forage. And even better, the root system is reaching deep into the ground and pulling, mining nutrients no other plants can get to up into its foliage. When that foliage dies, it releases it to the soil around it. What's been really incredible to watch is at a point in the forest garden in the early days of tending it, all of the area was covered in bindweed. As the front of the forest garden has matured, the bindweed has completely left. You'll see pockets of it here and there, but for the most part, bindweed is not a dominant plant there anymore. In the back and newer areas, it is covered in bindweed still, and I'm letting it go because I see this as kind of how do we actually ally with these organisms and say, you are a really good soil builder and you're doing your job. How do I let you do your job and work with that rather than expending a huge amount of energy pulling the bindweed out, which I actually think would delay our succession into the forest garden that we're looking for. Um, and again, there's a pig eating bindweed. I will say it is a lovely thing that whenever we have a staple crop field, and the pigs come through it, they get so much free food by eating the bindweed in the top layer of the soil. But I'm a little sad to say that after 5, 6 years of doing this, there is no more bindweed in those fields because the pigs have so thoroughly eaten it out. So I guess this is maybe just a plug for a mobile pig rototilling service to come eat your bindweed if you really don't want it, and a plug to maybe leave it alone if you can bear it. Um, but when it all comes down to it, I think the real heart of this philosophy and kind of what I really was eager to share tonight is how do you design landscapes that self-renew? Because at this point, this forest garden that we are working with, we pretty much don't manage the older parts of it at all. We harvest from it, we chop and drop a little bit here and there. Our ducks live in the forest garden, but mostly we've designed a system that's able to self-perpetuate. And I think the real opportunity that we have in urban and suburban areas is to use the water from our roofs, from our sidewalks, from our hardscapes to make it possible to grow forest gardens whether you choose to make it food producing or strictly habitat, the same principle applies of how do we design it so that it can take care of itself and function like a healthy ecology that we don't have to meddle with and that we can actually learn from and appreciate what's going on as an observer. Um, and so I think I would love to have some more discussion and questions and might plant a couple more questions to you in a moment. Um, oh, sorry, I forgot I had this slide. I'll go over it really quick. I think from a food perspective, the last thing that I'll just note is that to a lot of people that I talk to, this feels really great, but idealistic. Um, can we actually feed a hungry population of billions of people with these kinds of practices? And so, just for the sake of it, I did some math a few years ago, and I asked myself this question. The most calorie dense annual crop you can grow in most temperate bioregions is potatoes. Imagine a big annual crop field full of potatoes. Imagine an area of that field about the size of an apple tree. So the same amount of ground is being taken up. Do the apples or the potatoes have a greater yield of calories? Do you imagine? And maybe actually, Ben, can we make this a question?
Ready to go?
Great. So I'm curious for your perspective. Same area grown in apples, same area grown in potatoes. Which one of those actually has more calories? I'm getting a pretty even split between apples and potatoes, which is great. And in fact, quite accurate because apples and potatoes, on average, have roughly the same calories growing in the same area. But when you then think of what does that apple tree provide that the potatoes don't, you start thinking of the habitat. You only planted it once. Its roots are reaching way deeper into the ground and harvesting its own water. It's creating shade. It's cooling the environment. it has more support for pollinators, and you have a whole collection of plants you can actually grow in the understory that are also food producing. It tips the equation so far on the side of the apple tree. Um, the problem really is not our ability to actually produce calories or food in a system like this, because in fact, we can grow way more food in systems like this. It's more the labor side of the equation and the cultural context that we're sitting in of one, do we want to eat all these weird perennial foods? But two, how do we integrate this with large scale perennial agriculture? And there are really cool experiments that have been done to that effect. If any of you are interested in looking into them, New Forest Farm in Wisconsin is a great example. But I think what's more empowering for me to realize is how possible it is for us to feed ourselves this way in backyards, in parks, in spaces that are not supposed to be agricultural, but they're no longer wild ecologies, and we can do it in a way that is not necessarily a livelihood. And so at the Niwot Homestead, the way we've approached this is 15 people come out once a week on a Sunday. In those 3 hours that they come out, we do more than a whole work weeks of work for one person. That's pretty much enough to run this whole 1 acre property, and we share a meal together. And so it becomes this kind of fun extracurricular thing that we get to do together. And to me, that obviously is not a strategy that will work in all places, but it feels empowering to know that we have the ability to do that ourselves in a suburban and urban context, outside of the food economy entirely. And so would love to do some questions in a sec, but if anyone is excited to get further into these kind of concepts or learn more about this sort of work, a couple of opportunities I just wanted to mention. We do have volunteer days every Sunday year round at this homestead, and the registration for that will be opening in March. And so if you're excited about that, that's an opportunity. We're also doing a class that is a more deep dive for people who are ready to really start doing this on their site. And then I think you get access to these slides, but all of these organizations on the right would also be great to look at for events. Boulder Permaculture does a full permaculture design course. Water It With Love is a landscaping company, but they have a lot of classes in this vein too. And so really invite anyone who's excited to plug in further to maybe even just pop over to the website to see more about these. And I think I linked all of these things on the slideshow, so you should have access to that. But I'm going to go ahead and flip out of this for questions at this point.
We've had some great questions come in so far, and hopefully more as we continue. Um, for those of you who are going to be asking questions, if you could try to keep it in the Q&A box instead of chat box, that would just be helpful for me as far as monitoring everything and making sure I don't miss any. But I think our first question that should be a quick, easy one is whether Niwot Homestead does any tours.
We do. We usually have, we're, because of this suburban context we're in, we're trying very hard not to drive the neighbors crazy, but we do have two open houses a year, which will be on the events calendar. They're not yet set, but usually in spring and fall, we'll have a couple open house days.
Awesome. And if they just check out your website or sign up for the newsletter, that would be the best way to kind of stay
Yes.
informed.
Yeah, definitely.
Perfect. Next thing I noticed, our talk about like balance with what we would normally call pests, raised a lot of questions, particularly for people who are dealing with like specific pests. And so they were wondering if you had any recommendations for things like pine beetles, Japanese beetles, or
Hmm.
grasshoppers.
Yeah, really great question. I'll maybe address those one at a time. I think I have the most concrete experience with grasshoppers, and so I'll talk about that one first. But I have, it's kind of funny. We don't actually have like, there have been this grasshopper apocalypses the past couple of years, and for some reason they just haven't hit us, which might be entirely coincidental or because we have so much diversity that it's balancing it. But regardless of the diversity piece, I know people who have actually surrounded their garden with chickens. So there's literally like a chicken moat that you have to cross or a duck moat that you have to cross in order to get into a garden setting. And so I think working with allies like that, Muscovy ducks are the most incredible grasshopper hunters I've ever seen. Um, is a really positive angle that you can like to directly manage them. I also think that just ecological balance seems to take care of a whole lot, but that's not specific. It's like, how do you make sure that all the functions of an ecosystem are coming in? Um, Japanese beetles, really interesting one. I had an old mentor of mine who showed me all of these charts about how healthy your plant has to be to develop complex enough sugars to resist pests. Japanese beetles were like off the chart. Your plants have to be crazy healthy to be able to resist them. Um, I don't have a great answer for that one. I think that some of these newer insects that have come into our orbs have yet to find their predators, and I do think that birds will figure out how to eat them. I know someone who trained their chickens specifically to eat Japanese beetles by feeding them dead Japanese beetles until they became accustomed to it. And so I think those opportunities exist, but I don't have personal experience with them. What was the first insect? I feel like there was another one.
Pine beetles was the
Oh,
first one I
pine
said.
beetles. Yeah, I'm afraid I understand not enough about mountain ecology to really get into that, but I do understand that a lot of what is causing pine beetles to become such a problem is actually the shifting ecologies around them. The fact that their trees are inherently already stressed because they're dry, they're not able to resist those beetles as well. And I think the scale of land management that's needed to address those kind of things probably sits beyond what individual landowners can do. But for example, one amazing piece of work that's going on is a lot of fire mitigation has been hauling materials out of ecosystems, right? Like you take down the trees, you chip them, and you pull them away. Boulder Mushroom has been doing some really cool work to actually inoculate wood chips in place with mycelium so that they break down and help rehydrate the landscapes that are being threatened in the first place. And so, again, that to me, no individual landowner can stop that problem, but on a landscape management level, there's so much potential in things like that.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. Our next question was actually the first one that came through. Someone was wondering, like, from your perspective, Amy, what defines a weed? Is it just an invasive plant? Are there specific characteristics?
Yeah, I should maybe have defined that too. I think that what we call a weed is a plant that is very good at filling a disturbance niche. Right? So a plant that is really good and like adapted to when there's disturbance, they get there. And the only difference between a weed and a vegetable is that we want to eat one, so we call it a vegetable. And in fact, we've selected our vegetables to be worse weeds, if you will, over time because we want them to have other characteristics. But I would define a weed as a plant that is really good at dealing with disturbance situations and therefore tends to have qualities of being able to spread a lot of seed and establish in a lot of different conditions, etc.
Okay. Um, let's see. One quick one. Someone wanted you to repeat the name of that plant that tastes like a carrot, like a
Oh,
better version of a carrot.
Skirret.
Skirrets.
SK, here, I can, well, I can't type it. Skirret. There might be another T. I can't remember.
Next one, someone was actually asking about the difference between bindweed and morning glory.
Yeah. Morning glory is actually a very close relative of bindweed, but it's typically cultivated, and so it does seem to it's a pretty tenacious plant and will self-seed and grow, but it doesn't seem to have quite the vigor and tenacity of bindweed. It's mostly cultivated as an ornamental, and in certain probably other climates it maybe grows more wild, but I haven't seen that a lot here.
Thank you for that. Next, we've had a couple questions asking about tree guilds. First one was asking about how we get those started, how to establish them. Whether or not that's like an easy question to answer now, or maybe we can go back to the slides later on. But I just wanted
Mhm.
to put that out there.
I guess I'm curious maybe if whoever asked that wants to clarify like what specifically they were wondering about, because it could be like how do you choose the plants that go into the guild? How do you prep the soil for them? How do you approach spacing? Could we ask that person to maybe specify more? Is that okay?
Yes, of
Okay.
course. If you're still here, please
Mhm.
maybe just specify with a second question in the Q&A. Another one about tree guilds. Someone was just wondering if you are aware of any kind of in the Denver metro area or around. This person specifically asked from Central Colorado Springs, but any great examples you know about would be great.
Yeah, and again, I'm curious if that was a request for like wild growing guilds or cultivated guilds. Um, I can actually shoot, is it too late to share resources? Because I have a whole list of guilds that I've kind of played with and worked with that maybe I can share. Um,
Yeah, of course. We could do it like in the chat now if that's easier, or we could make sure it's included in our follow-up resource going out tomorrow.
it is going to take me a moment to find it, so maybe I'll
Okay.
send it to you. But I think on a high level, what I've found is that the individual plants matter less than the niches they're trying to fill. And so the building block guild simplified guild that I've often landed on is a tree that is in the rose family. That could be apple, it could be pear, it could be plum, it could be cherry. And then the understory plant families that work really well together are mint, carrot, onion, and aster. And then I always include a nitrogen fixer in a guild just for fertility building. I know we didn't talk about that function a lot, but that is usually for me a shrub. Siberian pea shrub and false indigo are my two favorites. But that is almost like I don't like to have recipes for things because context dependent, but those are a generalist collection of plants that often do really well together and fill different niches.
Thank you. Next one we've got up is asking for someone who's starting from scratch, what's the first thing they should be doing when starting their own backyard permaculture?
Yeah, there's a in permaculture, they'll tell you that you should do absolutely nothing other than observe for a full year. But I think really a lot that we didn't go into today is this permaculture design process, which helps us understand what are the conditions of my yard? Like, what is the soil type? What are the microclimates? What are the water catchment opportunities? What are my goals? And how do those two things unite? And so, usually, the first step is to actually go through that process deep landscape observation, clear goals articulation, and in the middle of those two things, you end up with a design and an approach to how to move forward. I realize that saying that that's not a simple first step, but that is how most permaculturists would approach it.
And in that same vein, is there like a minimum amount of space or land needed to start a permaculture?
No, I mean, the same patterns and principles can happen at any scale. I do think the bigger the area you have, the more of a robust ecosystem you're able to build. But there's nothing to say you couldn't have a guild whose centerpiece is a currant shrub and a few different herbaceous plants underneath it that takes up maybe 10 square feet in a postage stamp garden, and the same principles would be at play. So there's, yeah, no minimum or maximum.
Awesome. And then just as a heads up to everyone, it's at 7:30, so we've still got plenty of time for questions. If you have them, please keep them coming. Next question actually is going back to pests, and wondering if paper wasps, if they're popping up in their garden, what is something that they can do to kind of make more of a balanced system, or do they even need to be worried about paper wasps in the first place?
That's a great question. I don't think I can do justice to answering paper wasps specifically. Honestly, I also see them pop up. I usually ignore them. They never seem to get out of hand. But I don't know their specific ecology enough to know.
Not a problem. I'm going to switch over to the chat. I've seen some come in through there. We want to make sure we're not missing any important questions. Okay, so we have someone who is struggling with bindweed. Obviously cannot have, pigs in their property, but are there any insects or anything similar that might help manage bindweed?
My experience of bindweed is that there's almost I know people who have tried like releasing their predators or insects, but I've found vastly more helpful is honestly they don't like shade and they don't like deeply established fungal soil. And so if you can manage to get some sort of vegetation cover in place, especially something that wakes up earlier in the season before bindweed, it will likely shade it out. And if you can have a dense enough strip of that, great. Of course, those rhizomes do move pretty far underground. Um, in my vegetable garden, as I said, we keep pulling it out, but we use it as free mulch. We see it actually as a very beneficial thing because it's an incredibly nutrient-rich leaf matter that you can actually pick and ferment into a tea or just chop and drop. And so I don't see a good way to completely get it out of a system, but maybe to use it and to discourage it as two pathways when you're trying to grow it in a setting like a vegetable garden where it genuinely is happiest. Hmm.
Awesome. I've seen a few questions so far asking about like a pre-planting layering system or sheet mulching.
Hmm.
And I'm wondering if maybe we could just kind of go back and revise what was said about that.
Yeah, definitely. So basically, the concept of that is how do you build a compost pile in place? And so the layers that you put in lasagna mulching are often quite similar to what you would put in your compost, and it just really depends on what you have in hand. But you're balancing nitrogen heavy materials, which could be manures or grass clippings or green matter, with browns like wood chip or straw. And again, which materials you choose, it is really helpful to match to the type of system. Like if you're putting in a forest garden, use wood chip. If you're putting in an annual system, use straw. But ultimately, you're just layering those. And the cardboard is a layer that I mostly use to smother out the existing vegetation, which it's really good at. If you can get it wet, it will break down a lot faster. I like doing it in fall so that most winters it catches all the snow and that soaks into it and kind of holds it and decomposes it. But the idea is basically building a compost pile in place. And I honestly have found that the soil quality in places that I have lasagna mulched is so much better than the places that I have added finished compost in greater quantity that I think the value of it is the whole soil life community that's breaking down that sheet mulching is actually in place. And so you are creating a soil ecology as opposed to just like breaking the stuff down and moving it somewhere. So as a strategy, I think it's an incredible one.
Amazing. Thank you.
Mhm.
Let's see. I had one asking about your thoughts about using biochar in soil for permaculture.
Yeah. Everybody I know who's used biochar, which doesn't include me, says that it is helpful and it works quite well. But my take on it is that a whole lot of other things work equally well. And so if you have a lot of like biochar material you can turn into biochar on your property, amazing, use it. It basically acts in the soil very similarly to how humus does. It's not something that organisms are actively eating, but it has air pockets and it has surfaces where it holds water and air and nutrients way better. But so does humus. And so my take on it is like amazing tool, but you don't need to import it from halfway across the country or feel like you have to spend money on it to get the same effect. You can do it by building soil in the way most ecologies build soil and arrive at the same net effect. But if you have it, amazing.
Awesome. Thank you everyone for keeping these questions coming. We've got a lot. We'll get to as many as we can within our time for today.
Thanks
Um,
for moderating them, Ben. I know there's a lot.
no, of course. This one might be a bit of review, but they were hoping that you could repeat what kind of edible or non-toxic carrot family plants you typically plant with your apple trees.
Yes. I love this plant family. Let me list a few. Fennel is the one that fennel and true wild carrot or Queen Anne's lace are really, really nice because they bloom at the same time apples are maturing. So if your goal is pest management, that is a really nice one for apples specifically, but even ones that bloom at different times attract incredible beneficials to the garden. And so some of those include lovage. It's almost a perennial version of celery. That skirret plant that I mentioned before is also a carrot family plant and blooms at the right time for apples. Um, there's a understory ornamental plant called bishopsweed or goutweed that in a wet setting can be incredibly spready, so be aware of that. But in a dry setting, like our forest garden, is somewhat contained and you can actually eat the leaves. It was an ancient Roman cooking staple. Kind of a weird fun fact, but that's a really nice shade tolerant one, which is rare. There's a lot of annual or biennial plants like cilantro and dill and obviously actual carrots and parsnips and plants like that, but many times we eat them before they flower, so it's less practical to have in a forest garden. Oh, one last one that's also shade tolerant, sweet cecily. Early bloom, but one of my top favorite plants. Drought resilient, shade resilient, incredible beneficial insect attractant. I guess I could be putting these in the chat, huh? Sorry, I didn't think of that. There's the last one.
Let's see. I've had a couple questions from folks who say that the ground, the soil in their planting area is not much like soil at all. It's really hard, not a lot of nutrients in there. Um, the question specifically asked where to get it tested. I know that CSU Extension has a soil testing office just north of Denver, but I'm wondering first if you have any other recommendations for testing or what folks can do just to improve their soil quality when it is that bad.
Yeah. So I know CSU does soil testing. I usually use Ward Labs, but that might just be a statement of habit. But yeah, I usually mail samples to them. I think that in many cases, unless you're trying to either get a baseline so that you can track your soil improvement over time or grow a very specific crop with a very specific fertilizer, it may not be necessary to get a soil test to tell you what you already know, which is that your soil is really low in organic matter, which is what many people complain of. And so, um, if you need those values, great. But in general, some sort of mulch is where I would start. If you can go the whole spread of lasagna mulching, even better because there's more diverse stuff for the soil biology to eat. But that mulch, the real value of putting it in place is that one, you're adding organic matter, but even better, all the soil microbiology, like I said before, is going to eat their way up or dig their way up to eat that. And as they dig their way up, they're going to aerate. And then water and air are going to get in. And then that's going to enable the soil to further regenerate itself. And so, some sort of mulched soil covering. And eventually, if you don't put plants into that, nature's going to put plants into that. And so, you can choose plants that are really tenacious, like horseradish, for example, one of my favorites. You plant that horseradish, you will never need to do anything. It has tap roots that pierce the soil really deep. It produces a lot of biomass you can chop and drop. And so, picking plants like that, I'd say mulch, and then picking plants that are appropriate for your goals, or just really good at building soil and stabilizing the site is amazing. Mhm.
Awesome. Let's see. We've got a few folks who I think are just feeling inspired by what we've talked about today, and they're wondering if you have any resources you would recommend for kind of getting started, whether that's like a book, a video, a
Mhm.
website.
Yeah. Um, if you are not yet ready for the deep dive of like a permaculture course, but just want to get into it lightly, I think that one, I mean, honestly, coming to volunteer days at our project, not to be biased, but it is a cool way to get your hands dirty and see some of these systems in a pretty low commitment way. Some of my favorite books, maybe I'll go ahead and type them into the chat here. Gaia's Garden is pretty inspirational. Some of the principles maybe don't get quite as deep, but it's a really cool visual. Um, if you really want to go the agriculture route, restoration agriculture is one of my top favorites, but that's more broad scale focused. Um, if you really want to get nitty gritty, Edible Forest Gardens is the best book that I've read, but it's a mouthful and a mammoth of a book. What else? I'm trying to think accessible ones. If you like the water harvesting side of things, Brad Lancaster's works are amazing. I think those are probably the few good ones I have up my sleeve for this scale.
Amazing. And then I'm typing these in chat as well. And Amy, I think your chats are going just to you and me, and other
Oh,
folks
whoops.
can't see them. Not a problem. I'm getting everything put in there
Thanks.
now. So let's see. I've got Gaia's Gardens, Restoration Agriculture, Edible Forest Gardens, and then info from Brad Lancaster's. Did
Whoops.
I cover everything there?
Yeah, and let me change my chat so that you don't have to do that. Sorry, I didn't
No,
realize
no problem.
if I can change it. Oh, I can't change it. You'll have to do it
Oh,
for me, I guess.
can you do that now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, beautiful.
Great.
Okay, back to Q&A. We've talked a little bit about demonstration gardens, and we'll hopefully send some more resources in about demonstration gardens in our follow-up email. We have another question asking about composted manure. They said they haven't had a whole lot of luck with that, and they're wondering like what kind of places should they be looking to buy composted manure at?
Yeah, I've never succeeded in buying composting manure, but I've always succeeded in finding it from people who just have it around. I typically use horse manure because it's easy to get. There's two things about horse manure, plus and minus. On the plus side, horse manure just by itself is actually the perfect ratio of carbon to nitrogen to break down into compost with nothing added. So it almost like you stick that in a pile somewhere and forget about it, it just becomes a beautiful compost. Um, it's also really abundant and easy to get. A couple of things people don't always love about horse manure is a lot of seed will actually come through their guts still intact. That doesn't bother me much because by the time I sheet mulch with it, I'm smothering it out anyway. I usually put manure and then cardboard. And so whatever germinates just gets smothered out. So that's never been an issue for me, but it could be for somebody who isn't practicing that particular method. Um, the other thing, I think it's become quite uncommon, but there are a couple of specific horse feeds that used to have really pervasive herbicides that actually survived the gut. So it may be worth just asking what the horses are eating. I think it was like a couple senior feeds, and I don't know if that's still true, but just something to note. It is, I mean, having chicken manure and that sort of thing is wonderful, but I just don't know a lot of people who give that away. I feel like if people use it, but really finding people in your vicinity with livestock and asking is how I would probably approach it because I don't know. You can get like composted cow manure at Western, not maybe Western Disposal, but Colorado Materials is what I was going to say, but you'll pay for it. And I still am not sure about the quality. So
This is an interesting one and maybe similar to the other question we had about restoring soil. But this person specifically lives in a really windy place and has had trouble with restoring their soil. Do you have any special suggestions for that?
for wind in particular.
Hmm.
Yeah, I appreciate that that creates a slippery cycle where it's hard to get anything going because it dehydrates so fast and mulch blows away. And so it kind of self-fulfills. I would need to know more about your site to probably give really good advice here, but I think that some of the mulches that are less prone to blowing away would be a great start and really tenacious bare root plants that you can poke in that might have a chance of taking in those spring wet seasons just to anchor the soil. Some nitrogen fixers like Siberian pea shrub, for example, or depending, I don't know what altitude you're at, but false indigo, some of those really like early stage nitrogen fixing plants to hold the soil. I think there's probably a lot more I could tell you if I knew more about your context, but.
Let's see. I've got another one that maybe is a little niche, but this is someone who is trying to sheet mulch in an area that does not have access to irrigation. And I think they're just having trouble kind of keeping moisture in. So
Mhm.
when they're sheet mulching, is there more of like a specific material that you would add to help keep it moist?
I think, I mean, I like wood chips because they won't blow away so much, even if it dries out if they're dense as a top layer. But I also don't like a lot of people when they sheet mulch will tell you to sit there with a hose and soak it. At our property, we've never done that. We do our sheet mulching in fall and winter because it's when we have the extra labor and it's kind of nice winter work. And I think mostly it's timing it. If you can get it right before one big snowstorm, it will probably saturate enough to just start doing its thing. So I think it's a timing thing partly as well as just trying to get like a really good dumping of water right after you do it. And then it seems to hold that and start. But it is tricky with these long dry spells we've been having for sure to predict that.
Let's see. I had a question here asking about apricot trees and whether you would treat those any differently than you do with like cherry, plum, or apple trees.
Yeah, so the most apricots in this region don't fruit very often because they bloom so early that their blooms get hit by frost and then you don't get fruit. We actually have an apricot on the Homestead property and it is fruited exactly once in the 6 years I've been there. But a couple of strategies. This is probably too late if it's already planted, but if you can plant those trees in actually a cold microclimate, a north-facing hill, an area that doesn't get sun very much until the height of summer, it will delay the flowering of the plant. And so it's less likely to flower as early and you're more likely to get apricots. So that's just a note. But other than that, apricots follow a lot of the same patterns as other rose family tree canopy plants. Um, yeah.
Awesome. I'm seeing a couple questions here asking about irrigating
Mhm.
permacultures or guilds. Is that
Cool.
something that you do at the start? Is it designed in a way that it doesn't need additional irrigation from the beginning? How does that look?
I think you would design it very differently depending on how you plan to irrigate it. Part of what we're trying to figure out in our forest garden is how can you actually do this with very little water? And so our strategy for irrigating is we have a little kitty duck pool, and the ducks live in the forest garden, and every day we dump that pool to the adjacent plants and we move it. And I like that because the ducks also hang out around the pool, so that encourages them to move their fertility around with the pond. But that means that every plant gets a little dumping of water at this point, maybe once every 2 weeks. And we never really dedicatedly watered the like sprawling root systems of the fruit trees per se. And so that is an incredibly low water forest garden. I don't think it would work if the soil were sandy. Um, we have a very clay soil that tends to hold moisture really well. We also have a pretty high water table that I think helps a little bit, although at 10 feet, the fruit trees are not getting to that per se. Um, if you were to design a forest garden that was catching runoff from your roof, you would probably pick plants that are adapted to being flooded and dry. That's an interesting, unique subset of plants, too. You could probably design a forest garden that gets zero water in a dry place, but it would be a limited subset of species. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of flexibility in how you can do it depending on how you plan to irrigate. And I'm sorry, that is very open-ended, but I'm not sure I can get more detailed without another hour. So,
Not a problem. I had one interesting question here. I'm just going to read it straight out instead of trying to summarize.
mhm,
Um, let's see. This person was referring to the photo you showed earlier on with the clay scree on the left and the rich tree roots on the right. And they just
mhm.
wanted you to repeat what you'd said about the benefits and needs of this type of terrain.
Oh, yeah. That picture was actually just to try and show what's going on under the soil a little bit. But I think the main thing that I was trying to articulate in that slide is just the actual process of how all that organic matter from the top mixes with the subsoil, which is basically ground up rock to form the topsoil layer, and the plant roots themselves being really essential to that. If terrain is a question or consideration, I think I mean, there's so many water management strategies for a steeper terrain that again, I don't think I can do justice to in this moment, but really understanding what's the grade, where's the water coming from. You decide, do I want terracing? Do I want a contour swale? Do I want a rain garden? Do I keyline plow? There's a lot of strategies for using water that I can't get into right now, but I am actually giving a talk on water harvesting at Harlequins in a couple weeks. So if you want more info. Mhm.
All right. Definitely make sure to check that out. Right now it's 7:59. I'm going to do our outro speech really quickly. And I think we'll hang on and try to answer one or two more questions if we have the time. So again, thank you so much everyone for joining us today. We're really grateful to have your support tonight. And thank you as well to Amy. I learned a lot today, more than I could have imagined, and I hope everyone else did too. So yeah, thank you all for being here. Our seminar series this year runs through August. We've got lots more seminars coming up, and you can register again on our website, resourcecentral.org/seminars. When you exit the seminar tonight, you'll see a survey link pop up. If you have a moment to fill that out, we'd really appreciate it. Any and all feedback you want to provide to us is really appreciated. And again, keep an eye out tomorrow, maybe Monday, but probably tomorrow for that follow-up email. We'll be sharing the recording, another link to the slides, and some resources as well about different guilds and permacultures in our kind of Denver metro area. So thank you everyone for attending. We'll get a couple more questions in, but for those of you who are leaving, hope you have a great evening. Okay. Just a few minutes left, Amy. I think maybe get a couple quick ones.
Cool.
First, asking about your opinion on slate in a landscape, in our soil.
As in, like, there's actual like slate bedrock on the
So the question was,
Yeah.
how do you feel about slate? So I'm guessing they're asking would you feel about it as an additive to the soil if that's something that people do? I'm not too sure.
I've never heard about someone adding it. My suspicion is that if you just have like slate on your property and you're hitting a layer of like slate
Mhm.
bedrock, it is really challenging to work with hitting a layer like that. It is kind of a restrictive feature to whatever amount of soil you have above it. I don't know if that's what the question was, but I would not be thrilled to be trying to cultivate many things on top of slate bedrock per se.
Another question is, are pine chips okay to use for mulch? Are they too acidic or is there another issue with them?
Yeah, so that's again a lot of times when I'm trying to decide what mulch to use, I'm looking at what plants I'm trying to grow. If I'm trying to grow pine trees, I often preferentially choose pine mulch because it's going to break down into the soil microbiology that those plants often want. I often do steer away from a large percentage of pine mulch in other settings just because it is more antimicrobial, higher in carbon, slower to break down. And as you say, our soils are really alkaline, so I wouldn't worry about the acidity as much, but they do tend to just be very slow to break down and slightly antimicrobial for other settings.
Okay. Um, Actually, we had another question with someone who has a lot of granite in their soil. Is it kind of the same answer there that we gave with the slate? Are there maybe certain plants that work better in such a lean soil?
So I guess my question would be, are you hitting bedrock or do you have lots of ground up bits of rock in the soil and it's just a rocky soil? I got to visit a site a little while ago that was an incredibly rocky site, and I was fascinated to see that the plants growing on it were actually more water-loving plants than almost anywhere I had seen in the county. It was like a tall grass prairie grass community. And what I realized and did some research on this afterwards is the rocks actually mean that they push the water that does fall into like they almost like double the amount of water that's in the soil part of the soil because if that makes sense, I don't know if I'm articulating it very well, but there's a lot of like you can plant into a soil like that. You are never going to be able to rototill it. You're going to have to use other strategies, but the plants that are adapted to the kind of soil can actually benefit from enhanced water in a way in a soil like that if they're deep rooted enough and adapt. So you can plant into it would be my answer, and you can build it up like any other soil, but you'll never be able to till probably.
Okay. I think that's all the time we have. We're already a little bit over, but Amy, I was going to leave it open just for a little bit longer. If you check the chat, there's all kinds of nice messages from attendees today.
Oh, well. Thanks, everybody. And thanks for hosting this, Ben, for us.
Of course, it was my pleasure. I had a great time. But with that, I'm just going to say a final goodbye and thank you to everyone who joined us. We hope to see you next time for our upcoming seminars. And yeah, thank you so much. Everyone have a great night.